Good morning, and welcome to the JCC of Metro Detroit's 70th Annual Detroit Jewish Book Fair. My name is Nancy Finkel, and I'm a member of the Book Fair Committee. It is my pleasure to welcome you on this Sunday morning to Painted Pomegranates and Needlepoint Rabbis by Jodi Eichler-Levine. This is the 70th Annual Detroit Jewish Book Fair, and we're celebrating with an entire year of book and story programming. Join us as we honor the world's first Jewish book fair, highlighting diverse authors, curating new Jewish writing, and promoting the global art of Jewish storytelling. Our festival week, which concludes tonight, is just the beginning. Be sure to come back all year for exceptional opportunities to engage with the best of Jewish books and authors. To see our full event schedule, watch events you may have missed, and find our online store where you can find Painted Pomegranates and Needlepoint Rabbis and plenty of other hand-selected books and gifts, visit our website at culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair. If you enjoy this event and other book fair events, please consider becoming a patron or donating to Book Fair. You can do either or both at our website, culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair. We rely on our community support to make this annual event possible, so thank you in advance for becoming part of the family. The Book Fair team would like to thank the following for their support. Supporter, the Pomegranate Guild of Judaic Needlework, Southeastern Michigan chapter. I also want to extend our deepest gratitude to the whole Book Fair committee. Your dedication, innovation, commitment, and hard work have made all of this possible. We have a terrific event for you this morning, and we want you to be a part of it. You can ask questions and offer comments in the YouTube comments section below or by texting the number in the corner of your screen. Our speakers have a great discussion prepared, and they will take as many of your questions as they can. While you're here at our YouTube channel, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the reminder bell. That way you'll never miss any of our exciting events. The focus of this morning's event is Painted Pomegranates and Needlepoint Rabbis, How Jews Craft Resilience and Create Community. We have with us the author of the book, Jodi Eichler-Levine, as well as author, writing coach, and marketing entrepreneur, Lynne Golodner, who will moderate the discussion. Exploring a contemporary Judaism rich with the textures of family, memory, and fellowship, Jodi Eichler-Levine takes the reader inside a flourishing American Jewish crafting movement. Whether in groups such as the Pomegranate Guild of Judaic Needlework or the Jewish Hearts for Pittsburgh, a home studio, a needle-pointing rabbi, or a handkerchief embroidered with the Hebrew words Tikkun Olam, these everyday acts of creativity are a crucial part of religious life in America. Jodi Eichler-Levine is the Berman Professor of Jewish Civilization at Lehigh University and is also the author of Suffer the Little Children, Uses of the Past in Jewish and African American Children's Literature. Lynne Golodner, our moderator, is a marketing entrepreneur and the author of 8 books. She teaches writing at the university level and is the host of Make Meaning podcast. Please join me in welcoming Jodi Eichler-Levine and Lynne Golodner.
Thank you, Nancy. It was a wonderful introduction, and we're really honored to be here today. Hi, Jodi.
Hi, Lynne. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, Nancy.
You're welcome.
So let's jump right in. I have so many meaty questions for you because your book is such a delight and there's so much that we can talk about. But I do want to tell our audience to add their questions in the chat or text them, and we will get to them in the flow of the conversation as we go forward this morning. So Jodi, I'm just going to jump in. And you begin the book by talking about your Grandma Sally's needlepoint rabbi, which, despite it being so ugly as you described it, is displayed in your office. And you write about how you kept it because she made it by hand, and that in itself was enough reason to hold on to it. And then I'm going to quote from the book. You say that craft making is nothing less than an act of generative resilience that fosters survival. So that's like a loaded sentence, and I'd love for you to unpack that a bit. Tell us what you mean by craft making as an act of generative resilience that fosters survival.
Thanks. So when I started to write the book over 6 years ago, I was really interested in writing a broad book about creativity, craft, and Jewish life. But of course, when you write a book, you talk to actual people, you survey actual people, you find out what they say. And what I heard more and more was the idea of survival, of the way that people talked about how their sewing group had helped them get through the death of a loved one, or how the act of making something after a difficult political experience or a difficult world experience had helped them to feel better. I think some of that has to do with the fact that challenges are universal, and some of that has to do with the fact that I was writing from 2016 to 2019 in some pretty tumultuous times. Yeah. So all of those stories came out, and I think we really saw this in the pandemic, right? Because it's one thing to endure, it's one thing to survive. But what I mean by generative resilience is that the act of creation, of not just getting through it, but also creating something new, is particularly powerful. And we really saw this during the pandemic. So we saw the increase this last year or two of people knitting, baking bread, doing things with their hands that were alive. And I think that actually seeing that happen really brought home how relevant the research had been.
Well, and everything that you just mentioned is crucial to Jewish life too. Baking bread. I mean, that's, challah on a weekly basis. It just goes back, millennia. All of the, beautiful, I guess, needlework, or there's so many physical things that we use in Jewish observance. And so all these things that saw an uptick last year, or the last year and a half, they're so essential to how we observe Judaism. It's interesting. And it reminds me of when you quoted the cultural historian Constance Classen as describing touch as the hungriest sense, which I thought was really poetic and beautiful. And, obviously through touch, we engage with Jewish life. We also engage other senses, taste and scent. But you talked about a Judaism of literal feeling. I'd love to hear more about that.
Absolutely. And I love that quote, even though she's using one sense to describe another, right? But Judaism has this kind of attention to objects baked into its operating system, right? We have, if you look at the Talmud, it's filled with very specific instructions about objects and vegetables and how to build things the right way, right? There's a lot of bodies and touch really already part of Judaism. So when I talk about a Judaism of literal feeling, I'm talking about that sense. And it's also a pun because touch, our sense of touch with our hands, is so connected to our emotions. And one of the things scholars of religion have been looking at is the study of emotion and religion, affect and religion. And that's part of why Jewishness endures. Touch is a particularly special sense because it's truly in between. It's a case where you act on something and it is actually acting on you, even if your challah cover doesn't have agency, right? It's an object, but when you touch it in a way, it touches back. Or when people, are draped. I'm thinking of during a Jewish wedding when a couple is in some cases there's a ritual of wrapping the couple in a talit, a prayer shawl, right? There's a lot of in subjectivity there, and so touch is powerful because it is so very visceral.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it makes me think of my challah cover, which I purchased in Israel. I didn't make it, but every time I use it, it's really comforting. It's just it takes me back to that connection to where I got it and that sort of lineage. And even like my grandfather's talit was my wedding chuppah, and so that idea of endurance and survival. I mean, it's literal. It's one generation to the next. So as a writing coach and as a writer, I want to delve a little bit into your writing journey. And I just absolutely love your descriptive writing. It really takes academic material and makes it easily readable. And I even, of course, found pieces of alliteration sprinkled throughout and was almost giddy about it. But I'd love to hear about your writing journey and your writing process. Tell me a little bit about both.
So I'm one of those people who loves to write. I wanted to be a writer with a capital W when I was 9 years old, not knowing that there were even different kind of writers, right? So that's really my favorite thing, and I am lucky I get to do it in my job. For me, writing is its own crafting process, and interestingly, it's also tactile. So if I'm really stuck, or if I just need to get going, I take out a legal pad. I have one of my many trusty legal pads here. And I find that experience of having the pen touch the paper, I'm left-handed, so it smudges, but that actual feeling of seeing my words spill out onto the page in front of me really helps. So in one sense, and I see there's a nice comment about being a sofer, right? That the very creation of the Torah by a special scribe is a tactile thing. That's a great point. So I like to do that. And the other thing about writing a book like this, where I spent 3 years first doing an online survey, then doing over 30 long form interviews. So I was in people's homes. I was traveling. I'm also so lucky I wrote this book before the pandemic.
Yeah.
And also find that really changes how you think, right? There's little pieces of the book, like the introduction where I'm talking about being at the Pomegranate Guild of Judaic Needlework Convention in Atlanta, Georgia. And hello, Pomegranate Guild. Thank you, Pomegranate Guild of Southeast Michigan, for your support. I found I was literally in my hotel room going back and writing. And so that first draft process of being in a place as you write about it is so powerful, because we are creatures who live in bodies, right? And so for me, and it also happens in community, right? No academic book, no book happens without you workshopping chapters with friends, and also sharing quotes whenever I could get back to people, whenever I could find them again, with people I had interviewed, right? It's a conversational process.
It's almost like creating a book is a quilting of a sort, because you're stitching it all together, but then you have to go back and make sure that all the seams connect, and there's no abrupt transitions. So it is a process. And I always tell people that writing is 80% revision, because there's just so much perfectionism in, like, is this the right word? Is this sentence as beautiful as it can be? And you've done a really lovely job. So
Thank you.
kudos on that.
And people are scared to start. So the last thing is just don't be afraid of your crummy first drafts. You've got to get going.
Absolutely. You have to push through. They have to come out first. I love that you quote a Marge Piercy poem. She's one of my favorites. And the poem's called The Art of Blessing the Day, which is phenomenal. I actually have a reviewer's proof of that book from many years ago. So sort of dates me a little bit. But I wonder, do you think that most inspiration conveyed by Jewish women, even Jewish feminists, has come through art and communication more than, say, text or Jewish legal interpretation? And before you answer that, I want to tack on a follow-up question. Whatever your answer is to that, do you think that does damage to the Jewish feminist pursuit, of equal time and equal voice on the bima and in the community? So what do you think about that?
So it's a really complicated question, and I'm delighted by this, because I thought about it a lot in writing the book. I kind of worried that by really focusing on these crafts that have been associated with women, even though historically, actually, knitting was done in medieval guilds that were primarily male, right? But I worried that by focusing on these traditional women's work type things, that we would sort of reinscribe the idea that women are supposed to be doing things in the home. What about public facing things on the bima? What about being a major legal voice or a political voice? And I think that they actually can go together very well. And so on the one hand, I think women have made incredible contributions in the arts. Marge Piercy's work, Judy Chicago's work. There's so many Jewish women who have contributed in the arts, in music. But at the same time, sometimes that art is connected with activism, right? With having a political voice. We see that in second wave feminist art like Judy Chicago. And it's also, we're also really seeing an interesting moment right now in Jewish history where, for example, in the Orthodox world, in the modern Orthodox world, you have Yeshivat Maharat, which is in Riverdale. And there you're seeing some Orthodox women becoming legal experts, right? Becoming people like Rabbanit Leah Sarna, Darshanit Miriam Udell, many others who are also often scholars, are becoming these important public voices in their communities. And obviously we've had in the US women rabbis since 1972. So I think it's really a back and forth. I don't think one is exclusive of the other. And one of the things I really thought about in this book is that look at the 1970s, right? So the 1970s are when we start to see reform and Reconstructionist Jewish women taking a leadership role. And we see in the conservative movement Ezrat Nashim really pushing for women's voices. But it's also when the Pomegranate Guild of Judaic Needlework is founded in 1977. It's when the Jewish catalog comes out. And so that public voice and these kinds of do-it-yourself craft movements are actually happening in tandem.
Yeah, I love that. And I actually don't think they're mutually exclusive. Like this notion of, quote unquote, women's work as promoting the continuity of Judaism, plus the idea of matrilineal descent that, has lived for generations, that perhaps that identity does come through the hands and guidance of the women, and not to discount the men in any way, but there isn't just one way to identify as Jewish. And there's so much in the tangible that helps us to know way more than in maybe scripture or study. And, they all should be part of a really rich Jewish identity, but we can't discount those sensory experiences that happen day to day in the home and outside of it as well. So I did want to mention, we have a comment in the chat from Naomi Levine about how in the building of the temple, there were many crafts, and that included needlework and weaving, gold and metal smithing, woodworking, and others. And that is true. So this idea of craft making goes far back in our tradition as a way of really beautifying everything that we do, which is a question I will bring in a little bit later too. So I want to talk about your interest in generative resilience, which inspired the book, beginning with your relationship crafting with your grandma Eddie. So I know you come from an artistic family, and that in addition to your grandmother's endeavors, your mother painted with oils and knitted and crocheted, but that you didn't come to crafting until 2004 when you were in graduate school. So I would love to hear what brought you into the crafting fold beyond just your friend inspiring you to knit with her.
That's a great question. And the book does really interweave the personal with the professional. Yeah, when I was a kid, I was not so great at crafts. I mean, I liked to paint. I had a little knitting knobby, so I couldn't figure out how to crochet because I'm left-handed. Grandma tried to teach me right-handed. It didn't go. But I had a little knitting knobby where she would crochet and I would sit and make like a long braid. What happened when I was in my early 20s, early to mid 20s in graduate school in New York City, I found that this experience of doing something with my hands where I could actually see progress, right? Those of us who work with ideas don't always see our work finished, or like a book takes many years to write before you actually see, the physical product. But I was at a tough point in life. There had been a lot of, I'd lost my grandmother actually, and there had been a lot of losses in my husband's in those years. And so learning to knit was really, for me, a resilient practice. I didn't think about it that way. I just thought, oh my gosh, look, it's like Stephen Sondheim. Look, I made a hat. I made a scarf, right? Here's my dissertation, feels like it will never happen. Who knows if I even am going to get through grad school, right? We always look back in happenstance, but I almost quit grad school. And it actually helped me put myself back together and really see that I had this stuff that was alive. I mean, if it was on a sheep, it was once part of a living thing, but I had this wonderful tactile thing, and it had an ending, right? You can finish a shawl. And I find that for so many people I talked with, that process is so important.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's meditative and soothing as well. So can you speak a little bit about that, especially during the time that you were researching the book, because it's been a number of tumultuous years recently. And so how is that sort of a salve or soothing to go through some of this craft making?
Yeah, actually, one of my earlier interviews in California was in, I guess, early 2017. And I went to interview someone who's primarily known for making Torah covers and quilting. But she had her knitting right out there, just this huge scarf. And she'd had a hard time both personally and in the world. And she said, I just have to have my needles here. I have to keep knitting.
Yeah.
And I really think that that can also be a way of being resilient in difficult times.
Sure.
So one of the things in the book is the Jewish Hearts for Pittsburgh campaign, which sadly we just passed the 3-year yahrzeit of after the shooting at Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. Thousands of people from all over the country, inspired, and all over the world, were inspired by Hinda Mandel and Ellen Dominus Brood in a Facebook group to knit and crochet and make hearts out of popsicle sticks with little Jewish stars with hearts and send them to Pittsburgh. And it's this way, when things are tough, of both doing something that's meditative and calming, but also connecting with other people, right? It's about the idea that these objects that were sent to Pittsburgh and hung on trees all over the city are a way of showing that we aren't actually as alone as we think we are. And certainly these last 2 years, when to various degrees we've all been in our homes, craft has allowed us to send something forth that's not just in our bubble.
Absolutely. That's a beautiful description. Speaking of creating a community, I was really intrigued by the chuppah bee that you described in the book, where you sort of gathered people to create your wedding canopy, and that you see crafting as a way toward Jewish continuity. So I wonder how this speaks to Jewish identity. Tell me a little about that.
Right. So when we look at Jewish identity and how, in my opinion, it's always deeply connected with practice and with community and continuity. When sociologists ask Jews, what's the Jewish thing you've done in this last year? And they'll ask a whole list of things, right? Like Hanukkah candles, go to services, all these things you would expect. The number one answer for several surveys, predominantly, overwhelmingly, has been attend a Passover Seder. And there's a reason for that. Passover Seders take place in the home. They don't require a ritual expert, right? They can be done in the family. There are many different kinds of Haggadot, and they are tactile. There's food, there's smells, and there's objects. In my own family, we still have the matzah cover that my great aunt made. And so whether it's having a chuppah bee to put together a wedding canopy, or if it's creating Jewish Hearts for Pittsburgh, Jewish continuity and identity are really connected with these objects. That's how people remember things. And it's really already baked into Jewish communal practice in the 20th and 21st centuries. A lot of people in the chat have been talking about how it's baked into ancient Jewish ideas. But it's also, if you go to summer camp, you're going to make some crafts, right? You're going to make a macaroni picture Jewish star. And if you go to Hebrew school, you're going to make something. So at various points in our lives, in different ways, this experience of making Jewish objects is really connected to our identities. And it's the stuff you often remember the most, right? People might not remember what they did in fourth grade Hebrew school on Sunday, November 14th, but they will remember the year that Aunt Zadie spilled wine on the challah cover.
I love the mention of Passover, because we bring out, we did all kinds of tactile.
I just said challah cover for Passover. I'm so tired. So.
No worries. But we do all kinds of tactile things at our Seder. But one of the things I do is I bring out bags of my children's preschool projects for Passover. And every year my kids are now grown. I mean, they're teenagers, and they go through it and they say, I remember when I made, this comb representing the plague of lice. And I remember, and they're very cute, and some of them are funny, some are falling apart, and it's like they become transported at that moment to those early years, and it's so tactile. So it's just one of the best parts of Passover, and it's that tradition of things they made when they were 3 and 4. So very, very cool. Yes, absolutely. All right. So I was wondering if you believe that Jewish crafting speaks to the value of hidur mitzvah, which is the act of beautifying an observance so that it becomes more special. So tell me a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Yes, absolutely. Right. So this idea of hidur mitzvah, to add on to or enhance a commandment, goes back a very long way. And it's a central idea in Jewish tradition. And it was something that a lot of my interviewees specifically spoke about, right? They would say, this is why I do this. This is why I make special things for my synagogue. If you look at the practice of making a wimple or Torah binder in early modern Germany and other parts of Europe, people would take the circumcision cloth, cut it into strips, and do beautiful embroideries and paintings and other kinds of art onto it. And then it would become part of what held the Torah closed, become the Torah binder in the synagogue. And so whatever it is, we can always make Jewish observance a little bit more meaningful and a little bit more personal, which is also a very American thing, to make things more personal. Personalization. And both of those kind of bring up the experience of the commandment. Obviously, someone's fulfilling a commandment if they do the commandment. But hidur mitzvah, I think, is one of these wonderful things in Jewish traditions that says we are sensory creatures, right? It's not an aesthetic tradition, typically, depends on your exact example. And so this idea that part of our experience as Jews is to make the sensory inputs during prayer, during a Torah walk around the congregation, on Shabbat in your home, right? To make the candlesticks and the Kiddush cup and the challah cover. And yes, I know I said challah cover on Passover. Beautiful. Is really actually also a mitzvah. That is also important.
Well, I think we take more joy in the mitzvah when when we see beautiful representations of it. Like I think about when Hanukkah comes around, which it will in a couple of weeks, and we put all of our menorahs in the front window of our home. Like it would suffice to have one menorah and all of us to light it and say the blessings. But each of us has our own. And then there were the ones that my children made in preschool and, that we don't like because they're not safe. We would burn down the house. But, just that we have all of this, and it's memory and sensory and a feeling of just beauty for the holiday. And every single holiday has that. There's always something. So like we could make challah and it could just be like a bland little loaf, or we could make it braided or rounded or interesting shapes. I've seen people doing them in the shape of a turkey for Thanksgiving. And so I love the mitzvah, the idea of hidur mitzvah, because it's just enjoying the observance that much more. I think that's really special. It also gives us an opportunity to buy wedding presents. So you can make things more beautiful, right?
Absolutely. And people can make their rainbow challah for Parshat Noah, for the for the rainbow at the end of that story. And that's the thing now. You go on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, and there's all these rainbow challot, right? And so I love the ways that brings the Torah reading, the yearly cycle of the parasha, to life. And yes. I think that's just beautiful.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, we could just go on about this. I mean, there's so many ways to beautify all these mitzvahs. So, in this process, it took you years to write this book and to do all the research and interviews. Did you have any favorite interviews? And of course, we'll say this with a disclaimer that you loved all the interviews. So if anybody's watching and you mention one or two, it's not at the expense of another. But I wonder if there was a favorite or memorable interview or two that you could share with us.
Yeah, I'll mention too, even though that disclaimer definitely applies. Everyone was so wonderful. Actually, I saw her comment. Hi, Zelda. One of my favorite fairly early interviews was Zelda in Southern California on that trip. And Zelda is an amazing sewer. She was involved early on in the Pomegranate Guild there. And what I loved about talking with Zelda in her home with her dog on the middle days of Passover was this sense of light around her that she really talked about. She told me about the time that her sewing machine broke and she started doing all of her sewing by hand, her applique and other things. And then it became this meditative process. And for her, that kind of creation was really connected to spirituality. She called it very orthodox in the sense of always making objects, right? Not in the sort of more traditional sense. And she was so connected with these questions about memory and continuity and the durability of objects. And so I just particularly loved that interview. And the photograph I took of Zelda that's in chapter 1 of the book is, I think, my favorite photograph I took for the book. The other one I wanted to mention, because I was also thinking about favorite chapters, is chapter 3, which is about gifts and how the exchange of objects between people creates these bonds and is just vital. That one starts in Macon, Georgia, in a little town a couple of hours south of Atlanta, where I met Laurel Robinson. She's actually a painter by trade, but she also sculpts these beautiful handmade wooden yods. The yod is which means hand, is the Torah pointer used in the ritual reading of the Torah. And what was so cool about that day was that I visited her congregation. And so I saw the objects in action, and I met many of the people, the friends to whom she had gifted these objects. And it was just beautiful. The rabbi there had one that had been made from a piano key because he was a musician. And I saw him read Torah with the yod, and other people came over and showed me theirs. And so there was something so powerful, both about her lovely thoughts and wisdom, but also and humor, but also about the getting that of exchange so in such a really 3-dimensional way that was just so powerful.
Wonderful. As a writer, I'm curious how you decided who to interview. So was there a lot of pre-research to try to get your bearings and figure out how to wrap your arms around the subject? And then, how did you decide? There's just such a far-ranging, variety of subject matter in the book. So how did you decide who to interview and where to go?
It's a great question. And I did do a lot of reading for a few years before I started doing research. I did first I did this big survey, right, to get a sense. And I included all kinds of creativity, including creative writing, things that I never had room for in the book. I asked people, if it's creative, tell me about it. I did something called snowball sampling, which is where you target a few people or a few groups, and then you build from there. And so one person tells you, oh, I know so-and-so. And so you're getting deeper into a network. It's not the best as far as, say, a random sample goes. And so you get a less diverse result, but it lets you go deeper. So I had read about the Pomegranate Guild of Judaic Needlework, I don't know, back in 2013 or 2014. And I reached out to them and became an independent member and attended some of their conventions and interviewed not nearly all of their members at all, but several people. And I also, sometimes reached out through Jewish geography, and would, ask people in certain cities, can you pass this along, or, followed up with people from the survey. And so one of the hardest things about this book is that it could have been, 2 million pages long. And I actually really do hope to do more research on this over time, and to maybe in time create a digital exhibit with more people's objects. Mm-hmm. So it's really like a snapshot. It's a snapshot of a few years of time, and a few places actually all over the country, in New York City and in Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. And I also did something called participant observation, which is where you learn by doing. So being at the craft conventions, or I spent, about 2 years, whatever month that I could go, at a monthly synagogue knitting circle here in Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. And they're in the book. And so you also just learn through that everyday interaction with people. Mm-hmm. So that's how I did it, with a few targets. And I ended up focusing on things people make with their hands. Mm. There's so many other kinds of creativity, but I ended up focusing on the tactile.
Love that. So, you bravely share in the book about how you were diagnosed with cancer, and you're okay now, right? Yes. Yay. Good. But that after your diagnosis, you became the recipient of handcrafted gifts from some of the people that you feature in the book. And you said that knitting or other craft making can be a parallel to prayer. So how did your shocking experience change or impact the storyline of the book?
Thank you for asking that. And so first of all, I'm totally fine now. I had pretty serious cancer in 2018, right in the middle of writing the book, but all my scans have been clear. So that's just challenging every 6 months. Yes. So it really changed how I think about objects and materiality. It really made me think actually about what it's like to be isolated. And I was thinking about it, before the pandemic, because I had the experience after surgery of sort of having to cancel everything for the summer, being at home. And I remember so vividly, sitting on the couch, digging back into writing the book, and receiving these gifts in the mail, receiving a shawl from the local knitting group, and crying and being so moved because I had been there making shawls on lap blankets with them, and receiving other gifts from friends, a handmade mug from a friend who does pottery, right? Socks, all these things. And I realized that I wasn't as trapped in the margins of my own skin as I thought I was, because I think illness can make you feel like when you go into an operating room that you're alone, right? Mm-hmm. There's all these doctors and nurses there, but you're in this sterile space. And actually, one of the phrases someone used in an interview was that that these acts of creation, it's not sterile, it's a fertile thing, this creation of new objects. Yeah. And so that really shaped the book, because I got this sense that care happens in objects. One interviewee in that same chapter used the phrase that for her, knitting was her language of prayer. And so I really think we do sometimes have to think beyond written or spoken language to other kinds of embodied communication. And I don't think I would have thought about that quite so deeply, quite so profoundly, if I hadn't had that challenging experience.
I'm so glad that you made it through and you're here with us today. Thank you for sharing that and being really vulnerable in this interview. So I appreciate that. To go to a less personal topic, I wonder if you could speak a bit about this idea of post-denominational Judaism. You mentioned it in the book, and I'd love to hear about how this notion is relevant today and what it might forecast for our future too.
Absolutely. So that's an idea a lot of scholars have been talking about. So I'm thinking especially of work by Shaul Magid in some of his important books that talk about this subject. And just in general, when we say, denominations, right, we're talking about a particular strand of a religious group, right, in the Jewish case, Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, and many kinds of Orthodoxy. And that's actually just a short moment in Jewish history. I mean, there's always been variation in Jewish history. No time period without variation among Jews. But the idea that we have structured denominations is really something that develops in America and parts of Europe in response to being in an environment of Protestantism, right? Protestants have many denominations. And so in the modern world, Jews develop them too. I think what we're really seeing, especially in the last 20 to 30 years, is a breakdown of that and a lot more diversity in terms of race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, lots of things. But a lot more blending of the denominations. So you wouldn't necessarily see that much of a difference between a Reform synagogue and a conservative synagogue, depending on what city you were in. The prayer book would be different, but there might be a lot of practices that were quite similar. And more, there are things like crafting that transcend denominations. So when we're talking about post-denominational Judaism, it's really that a lot of the exciting centers of Jewish life today are things where it doesn't matter if you were raised in a particular kind of synagogue or a synagogue at all.
Yeah.
If you look at the Jewish food movement, for example, the new Jewish food movement, which really got going in the 90s. If you look at Jewish farming movements and ecological movements, you look at Hazon, you look at Urban Adamah, all of these kinds of nonprofits that are bringing together Jews from lots of different backgrounds and types of observance, and focusing on an issue of of the environment, or of Bal Tashkit, or of caring for animals, or of not wasting.
Sure.
And so I think that that's actually the future. A lot of prognosticators of American Jewish life like to say, oh, it's really going downhill. And it's true. I mean, if you look at denominations, if you look at synagogue affiliation, it is going down. But I actually, much as that is painful and hard, and, I belong to a synagogue, I see these challenges all the time. But at the same time, I say, look to people who are in the Granite Guild, right? They're from many different backgrounds. One of the things I loved about the convention was seeing, everything from, there's glatt kosher breakfast for those who need it. There's people eating bacon in the restaurant. I hope no one's mad that I said that, right? Like, there's all these different things, right? And there's people, everything from, very modest dress to shorts. Everyone there was from a different kind of Jewish background. No one is better or worse than the other. But they all came together around this love of stitching, of Jewish ritual, of Jewish objects. Yeah. And I think that actually, even though I grew up in a very denominational world in the late 70s and 80s, I really think that that gives us a lot of hope for Jewish life today.
Yeah, I like to say I'm just Jewish because I've dabbled in Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, and I'm like, okay, let's take a bit from each and reject a bit from each, and let's just be Jewish. So I kind of love that idea. So I want to ask you two more questions. One is what your hopes are for this book. Where would you like to see it, impact people, or what kind of outcomes would you like to see about this book?
That's a great question. That's a challenging question. I would say, if people take one thing away from this book, I'd like them to take away the idea that Jewishness is a process. It's like moving towards a horizon. I hope that people who are both Jewish and non-Jewish will read it, because it really speaks a lot to what it's like to make meaning in the contemporary world. And that's a question for everyone. But I think a lot of times, and I say this as someone who's taught religion for a long time in a religious studies department, a lot of times people think of religion as something that's fixed. It's been written down. My students, will say it's about rules, right? It's been written down. There are rules. Follow the rules. But religion is really an active process. Judaism is an active process that is always changing. It's always evolving. I'm going to sound like Mordechai Kaplan here. It's an evolving religious civilization, and and so if you take something from the book, whether you were moved by the stories related to illness, or you were moved by the stories related to tragedy, or you were moved by the stories of people having fun at their Passover seders, or tying their tzitzit before they become bar bat mitzvah. All of those are about this horizon. No, there's no perfect Jewish anything.
Right.
There's just a limit, like a mathological limit that we're moving towards. And we keep, you almost touch it, you almost get there. I'm screwing up my math, but you kind of keep moving towards like a tangent, but you never quite hit it, and that's okay. There's no perfect Jewishness. It's a process.
I love that. That's a beautiful way to phrase it. I hope everybody takes that and more from this book. The last question I wanted to ask you today was about what's next on your horizon. I know there's another book in the works, and I want to tell you that actually I taught a webinar yesterday about how to write guest essays or op-eds, and I shared one that you wrote about Hamilton. And so I said, and we just were sort of deconstructing and looking at how you wrote it and how you made your argument. So tell us a little bit about what's on your writing horizon.
So my next book is tentatively titled Faith in Disney and American Religion. I'm writing a book about the intersections between religion and the Walt Disney Company, which will be 100 years old in 2023. It was founded in 1923. And so that has been tremendous fun. It got curtailed a bit by the pandemic because I did some research before and then couldn't travel, and I've done some more research. And so it's interweaving some of my own stories again with a lot of observation and cultural criticism of how the Walt Disney Company, much like a religion, influences people's worldviews, people's practices, and is really a site of devotion and meaning making. And so, the op-ed was from last summer, or 2 summers ago, why Hamilton is the most Disney princess. And so I've written a couple of online pieces about that, and about how, in a way, especially with all of their intellectual property, we're all telling Disney stories now in one way or another. And it's not necessarily always sympathetic. It's also critical. But it is sympathetic to the fact that even though Disney is a corporation, it's a way people are making meaning in their lives. People get married there. People remember relatives they've lost there. They celebrate there. And even if you're not in the physical parks, people are relating to the universe through these stories. And that's what religion is about.
And I like how you keep referencing making meaning. I mean, I host the Make Meaning podcast. And so I'm obsessed with the idea of how we make meaning out of the mundane, that we live these very ordinary lives with extraordinary moments. I wonder, we have a few minutes left, if you might riff a little bit on this notion of making meaning and how that ties in with all that we've been talking about.
Sure. And and I think it's so great that you're working on that, right? I think a lot of times we focus on the extraordinary. That's what gets covered in the news. That's what we notice. But the quotidian is magic, right? The everyday. I'm sitting here looking out my window at this perfect foliage here in eastern Pennsylvania. And that's kind of what got me into studying religion, actually, was I was interested in everything, politics, history, English, poetry, just all of it, right? And when we find meaning in the everyday, we're really transforming the world, right? I think the idea of worldview is also an important one in the history of how people talk about religion. And it's not that you have one worldview. It's always shifting. But if you look, for example, at something like running, I'll pick running because that's another one of my hobbies.
Because you just ran the New York City Marathon, didn't you?
I did. I wasn't looking to go there, but I just ran the New York City Marathon.
That's amazing.
On my mind. Thank you. It was a magical experience, precisely because, right, the city is alive every day. The city is always alive. And when you run, you feel it differently. When you run in a park, every place I've visited that I've run, I come home a little bit different because it's just 2 feet on it, right? Or the pavement, right? Your running shoes are such an everyday object, and you replace them every 300 miles. But they're this piece of stuff that can take you all over the world. Back before the pandemic, I remember running in London, right? That was just, and for a lot of people, it was their everyday run. For me, it was a big deal. But it's the same if I run in my neighborhood, right? Is this everyday space that I ritually run in at 5:30 in the morning is different every time I do it. And so I think what Judaism does so powerfully is do that with the everyday. That's the beauty of Jewish blessings, right? One of the things a lot of scholars and theologians have talked about is that there's a blessing for everything. There's a blessing for the first time you see blossoms in a blossoming tree in the spring. There's a blessing for seeing a rainbow. There's a blessing for going to the bathroom. There's so many blessings, and that makes everything holy, whether it's our intestines or trees, wonders of nature. Those are all wonders of nature, right? And so for me, part of what's so beautiful about Judaism and so many religious traditions is that way of cueing your attention so that you see that meaning. And it's different for everyone, but it causes you to pause. It's a pause. A blessing is a pause.
Yeah.
And that helps you see something new in the everyday.
Absolutely. Well, this has just been a wonderful conversation, Jodi. I'm so excited to have the opportunity to read your book and speak with you. In the chat, there is a link of where to purchase this beautiful book. We can support our JCC book fair and purchase from their online bookshop. And I'm sure you'll find many more great titles as well. So Jodi Eichler-Levine, thank you so much for giving us your Sunday morning and a little bit of an insight into your journey writing this book.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for coming. And thank you so much to the JCC of Metro Detroit for having me. This was really just an honor and a pleasure.
Excellent. So here's Nancy.
Thank you, Jodi and Lynne, for being with us and for such a wonderful discussion. And thank you to all of you at home for joining us. Our next event in honor of Irwin Shaw is Can We Talk About Israel with Daniel Sokach this afternoon at 1:30. Remember to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and visit our website, culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair for our full schedule and ways to get involved. See you next time.